My stepdaughter told her friends I was mentally unstable when I attended parents' meeting at her school. They all laughed and mocked me. When I told her mom, my wife, what her daughter had done, she said, "She is young. Maybe she is right." I smiled and left her. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Ray Anderson from New York. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. I never asked to be a stepfather. It wasn't something I dreamed about or planned for, but when I met Patricia, it just came with the package. I was in my early 40s then. Well established, running my own business, and finally ready to settle down after years of chasing success. She was elegant, sharp-tongued in a way I found endearing, and the mother of a 13-year-old daughter named Talia. From the beginning, Talia kept a certain distance, the kind that felt more like a performance than genuine shyness. I thought it would pass. I thought if I was patient, kind, generous without being overbearing, she would eventually warm up to me. I didn't want to replace her father, who, from what I was told, hadn't made much effort to be in her life. I just wanted to be someone she could trust. But there's something uniquely cruel about teenage girls, especially the ones who learn early that a man's decency is a thing to test rather than treasure. When Patricia asked me to attend the parent-teacher meeting because she had an unavoidable work trip, I said yes without hesitation. I wore my best navy suit, polished my shoes, even brought along the tiny leather notebook I used during board meetings, some old habit of mine, a way to show I take things seriously. The school was pristine, one of those institutions that pride themselves on producing well-rounded, socially polished kids. I sat through the teacher's report, nodded appropriately, and asked a few questions that showed I cared. But something felt off. The other girls in Talia's class, sitting with their parents or just milling about near the auditorium, kept looking at me. Not just looking, whispering, smirking, occasionally bursting into muffled giggles when I walked past. One girl even turned her phone toward me for a quick snap before covering her mouth with fake surprise. At first, I thought it was teenage nonsense. But then I caught a phrase. "That's him, the crazy stepdad." The words hit harder than I thought they would. It took every ounce of restraint not to react. I smiled, nodded at one of the girls who was bold enough to meet my gaze, and made my way out of the school before the pit in my stomach turned into something less dignified. The drive home was quiet, and I kept replaying what I heard, wondering if I'd misunderstood. But by the time I walked through our front door, I knew I hadn't. There was no way that many kids could be laughing at something they hadn't been fed. I waited until dinner was done and the kitchen was clean before I brought it up to Patricia. I told her everything, how I was mocked, how her daughter had clearly said things behind my back. I expected anger, or at least concern. Instead, she took a long sip from her wine glass, shrugged, and said, "She's young. Maybe she's right." She said it like she was commenting on the weather. No empathy. No defense. Not even curiosity. I smiled. That's all I did. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I had reached a place past hurt. There's a kind of silence that creeps into you when you realize someone you love doesn't love you back in the way that matters most. Respect. It's such a simple thing, yet it defines everything. I went upstairs, changed into my pajamas, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling while she scrolled through her phone like nothing had happened. And in that moment, I made a decision, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I wouldn't fight. I wouldn't argue, but I would act. And come morning, things would be different. Morning came heavy. Not because I didn't sleep. No, I slept just fine. It was the kind of sleep that comes after something inside you breaks and the pieces settle into a shape that feels final. Patricia was still asleep when I got up. Her face looked peaceful, almost soft, like the years had been kind. And for a moment, I stared at her, wondering how I could love someone who didn't flinch at my humiliation. I brewed coffee quietly, sat down at the kitchen island, and opened my laptop. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was colder, precise. A kind of emotional detachment I'd only experienced once before, when my own father disowned me for leaving the family business. This was different, but it felt just as permanent. I logged into my accounts and started making changes. First, I revoked Patricia's access to the shared cards. Nothing dramatic, just removed her as an authorized user. Then I called my attorney and asked to schedule an update to my will. When his assistant asked if it was urgent, I said yes. Because it was. Respect, once lost, is like a dropped vase. You can glue it back together, but it never holds water the same way again. Patricia walked into the kitchen around 8, yawning and stretching, her robe barely tied, her hair a soft mess of curls she hadn't yet tamed. "Morning," she said casually, as if last night hadn't happened, as if my dignity wasn't still bleeding out somewhere on that school auditorium floor. I nodded, handed her a cup of coffee. She took a sip, smiled. "Thanks, babe." I sat across from her and said nothing. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I knew anything I said would only soften the blow of what I'd already set in motion. There's a strange kind of power in silence, especially when the other person doesn't know a storm is coming. She scrolled through her phone while sipping her coffee, occasionally laughing at something online. I wanted to ask her, what kind of woman shrugs off her husband being publicly mocked by a teenager? But I already knew the answer. The kind who never saw him as more than convenient, useful, temporary. Around noon, Patricia called me from the boutique she'd driven to, her voice unusually shrill. "Hey, my card isn't working," she said. "Is there some issue with the bank?" I kept my tone even. "No issue. I removed your access." Silence. Then what? Not confusion. Shock. As if she hadn't believed I had it in me. "I also took you off the will," I added. "Spoke to Martin this morning. The updates will be filed by the end of the week." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "Wait, are you serious right now?" I said yes. I told her I wasn't angry, just disappointed, and that I was done investing in people who found my humiliation amusing. She was quiet for a long time before she said, "It was a stupid joke. She's just a kid, and you," I interrupted, "are a grown woman who chose to defend her." She started to say something else, but I hung up. That afternoon, she came home early. Her face was tight, her eyes red. I was in my study, working through some invoices, the door wide open. She stood there like she was waiting for an invitation. I didn't offer one. "We need to talk," she said. "No," I replied calmly. "You need to listen." She crossed her arms, a gesture meant to show strength but only revealed how cornered she felt. "You're overreacting," she began. "Talia is a teenager. They say dumb things. You know she doesn't mean half of it." I looked at her and said, "I didn't expect her to be perfect, but I expected you to have my back." She scoffed. "So you're going to throw away our marriage because of one comment?" I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap. "Not one comment. A pattern. A truth I've been ignoring." Her face fell in, not with sadness, but with realization. She hadn't thought I'd ever choose myself. That night, she slept in the guest room. The silence between us was no longer passive, it was strategic. She was calculating her next move, and I was preparing for mine. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no pleasure in this. But there was a quiet certainty. A boundary had been drawn, and I would no longer allow anyone, wife, stepdaughter, or otherwise, to cross it unchecked. When I went to bed, I felt the weight of my solitude, but also its clarity. Sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to stop explaining why you deserve it. The next few days unfolded with the kind of eerie calm that often precedes a storm. Patricia was trying, at least in the way people try when they've realized they pushed too far but aren't ready to admit they were wrong. She cooked more, asked about my day like it mattered, and even suggested we plan a weekend getaway. Just the two of us. I nodded politely, told her I'd think about it, but inside, I'd already checked out. It's a strange thing, detaching from someone you once loved. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in quiet layers. When you catch them looking at you like they don't see you, when their laughter feels rehearsed, when their apologies arrive only after you withdraw something they used to take for granted. Love, without respect, becomes a performance. And I had grown tired of playing a part in a show I no longer believed in. Talia, for her part, barely looked at me. She slithered around the house like a cat who knew she'd knocked over something fragile but wasn't sorry about it. I caught her once in the hallway, earbuds in, phone glued to her hand, and I simply nodded as we passed. She didn't nod back, just kept walking. No apology, no shame. And yet, I knew, from the way her eyes flickered away, that she understood something had shifted. I had once tried to reach her, tried to be a kind, consistent adult in a life where her father was more ghost than man. I bought her birthday gifts, helped with her science projects, paid for her summer camp. None of that mattered. The moment I became inconvenient to mock, I became disposable in her eyes. And I wasn't going to beg for a role in a family that saw me as a punchline. 2 days after I made the financial changes, Patricia called me while I was at the office. Her voice was soft, nervous. Talia told me she's sorry. She said she didn't mean it like that. I almost laughed. Did she say that to me? Or just to you? Silence. Then she's embarrassed. She should be, I replied. And so should you. I hung up before she could say more. That night, I found Patricia sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at her wedding ring like it was some relic from a past life. I messed up, she said when I walked in. I didn't sit down. Just loosened my tie and started unbuttoning my shirt. You didn't mess up, I said. You showed me who you are. I just finally believed you. She blinked fast, like she wasn't prepared for that level of honesty. But I was done sugarcoating. Respect isn't a debate. It's a baseline. The next morning, I went to the bank to finalize some additional changes. I removed Patricia as my emergency contact, closed our joint savings, and opened a new account in my name alone. I moved quietly, like a man preparing for a quiet exit. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I no longer trusted her. When someone watches you get humiliated and laughs, you don't give them access to your lifeboat. You build another ship. Alone, if necessary. That evening, Patricia tried again, this time with tears. I was just caught off guard, she said. I didn't think it would hurt you that much. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, that's the problem. You didn't think of me at all. Family called that weekend. Her sister, her cousin, even her mother. Each of them reaching out in varying tones of concern and confusion. She told us what happened, one said. Don't you think you're being a little extreme? Another asked. I didn't argue. I just repeated one sentence. My money is for people who respect me. That line became my shield, my mantra, my truth. And when Patricia called me cold, I reminded her that coldness is often born from the fires people leave us to burn in alone. By Sunday night, the house felt different. Not quieter. Just emptier in a spiritual sense. I could feel their energy changing, like people trying to recalibrate a system they'd always assumed they controlled. Talia barely spoke. Patricia hovered, passive-aggressive in her chores, over-apologetic in her language. And me? I reclaimed my peace. I cooked dinner for myself, cleaned up my own dishes, and went to bed early with a book. No tension. No drama. Just a man who finally understood that loyalty should never be given to those who mock your pain. By the second week, the silence had grown teeth. It no longer felt like the absence of sound. It was an entity in the house, stalking every room, sharp and undeniable. Patricia no longer made passive efforts to reconnect. Now she moved like someone afraid to be noticed, afraid that one wrong word might shatter what fragile ground she still stood on. Talia had stopped pretending to be indifferent. Her glances were furtive, and when I passed her in the hallway or caught her in the kitchen, there was something behind her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not remorse, she was too young and too proud for that. But unease. A quiet understanding that something in this household had changed forever, and that it began with her mouth. I started leaving the house earlier in the mornings. I told myself it was because of work, and maybe that was partially true, but mostly it was about space. Breathing room. I needed to be away from the constant tension of forced civility. It's a strange thing, living with someone you're no longer emotionally tethered to. You share the same air, the same lights, even the same bathroom mirror, and yet the emotional distance is so vast it might as well be an ocean. I stopped waiting for apologies. The part of me that once hoped for acknowledgement, for redemption, had withered. And in its place stood something far more resilient. Resolve. Not bitterness. Not revenge. Just resolve. One morning, while sipping my coffee in the living room, I heard Talia talking on the phone in her bedroom. Her door was cracked open just enough, and her voice was low but clear. I don't know what his problem is, she whispered. He's acting like I committed a crime. It was a joke. Everyone jokes. He's being dramatic. She paused, then added, Mom said he's cutting us off. Like financially. I think he's actually serious. The words didn't surprise me. What caught me off guard was how little she understood. Even now, in the face of real consequences, she couldn't grasp that respect wasn't a game, and I wasn't a prop in her social theater. She still thought this was about money. She didn't realize it was about worth. That same evening, Patricia finally said what I'd been waiting for, though far too late to make a difference. We were sitting at the dining table, eating quietly. She pushed her plate away, folded her hands, and said, "I should have stood up for you." I didn't look at her. I kept chewing. "I wasn't thinking," she went on. "I was just defensive, I guess. Talia is my daughter, and I reacted like a mother. But I shouldn't have said what I said." I set my fork down gently and looked her in the eye. "You didn't react like a mother. You reacted like a woman who thought my dignity was negotiable." Her face paled. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I asked. "You had a choice, Patricia. One moment. To affirm me or mock me. You chose mockery." Her lips trembled, but I didn't flinch. I'd waited too long to be heard to retreat now. The next day, I started getting calls from people I hadn't spoken to in months. A cousin I never particularly liked. An uncle who always needed something. Word had spread. Patricia had told someone, maybe several people, and now the narrative was being shaped without me. I was the cruel stepfather. The overreacting husband. The one who punished a child for being immature. Each call carried a flavor of judgment, thinly veiled as concern. "You sure you're not being too hard on them? Family's complicated, man. You gotta give grace." I listened. Patiently. Politely. Then I repeated my truth. I am not obligated to finance my own disrespect. Some of them got quiet. Some tried to argue. But I didn't waver. That weekend, I went for a long drive, no destination, just miles under my tires and music filling the car. I needed to think, to exhale. Somewhere along Route 17, with the sun dipping low behind the trees, I pulled over and just sat in the silence. Not the kind that echoed in my house, but the kind that heals. The kind that says, you're allowed to protect your peace. You're allowed to walk away from people who don't honor your presence. I thought about my own mother, how she used to say, "Don't let them teach you to shrink." And I realized I had been shrinking. In laughter I didn't deserve, in silence that excused disrespect, in relationships that asked me to make myself smaller for the sake of keeping things together. When I got home, the house was dark, quiet. I found Patricia in the living room, curled up under a blanket, her eyes tired. She didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't offer small talk. And for the first time in weeks, I saw her without the armor of denial. "I think you've already left me," she said softly. "You're still here, but you're not really here." I sat down across from her. "I left the moment you laughed at my pain," I said. I just hadn't packed yet. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't move to comfort her. Sometimes pain is a necessary teacher, and I wasn't going to rob her of the lesson. It was Patricia's idea to host the dinner. "Just family," she said, "a chance to talk, to clear the air." I didn't argue. At that point, I didn't have energy left to fight. What she wanted was a performance, a curated reconciliation, a gathering where everyone could pretend we were still a functioning family. I knew what it would turn into. A jury. I would be the defendant, seated at the head of the table while her relatives and mine dissected my choices like vultures over a fresh wound. Still, I agreed. Not because I expected fairness, but because sometimes silence needs an audience before it can finally be heard. The house was immaculate by the time the first guest arrived. Patricia had cleaned like she was preparing for a magazine shoot. Candles lit, jazz humming low, wine glasses perfectly spaced. She wore a soft cream sweater, gold earrings, and that artificial calm she always pulled out in public, like armor. Talia, as expected, disappeared into her room the moment the doorbell rang. I sat in the living room, sipping bourbon, waiting for the moment the air would turn. It didn't take long. Her sister, Nadine, was the first to take a seat across from me. "You know," she began, smiling too brightly, "teenagers say dumb stuff all the time. I told my mom once she looked like a witch. Kids are brutal." I nodded. "Sure. And what did your dad do when you embarrassed your mom in public?" She blinked. "What? Did he laugh?" I asked. "Or did he correct you?" Her smile faded. She didn't answer. Patricia walked in, tray in hand, and gave me a look that begged for restraint. But I had none left. Dinner was served. Chicken marsala, roasted vegetables, garlic potatoes, every bite tasting like obligation. Conversations floated around me, small talk, work updates, harmless gossip, but the tension undercut it all like a taut string ready to snap. It wasn't until her mother cleared her throat and set her wine glass down that the real discussion began. "I just think," she said, not looking at me directly, "that when you marry someone with a child, you marry the child too. You can't just withdraw your support because you got your feelings hurt." I set my fork down gently. She didn't hurt my feelings. She undermined my humanity. And her mother laughed. Patricia's face stiffened, and the room got very quiet. "Okay," Nadine jumped in, trying to smooth it over. "But still, you're the adult here. Shouldn't you be setting the example?" I leaned forward. I did. I set the example of what it looks like when a man chooses not to be humiliated in his own name. When he draws a boundary and says, "This far, no further." Her cousin, from the end of the table, chuckled nervously. "You sound like a therapist." I turned to him. "No, I sound like a man who spent years providing, protecting, and showing up for people who, in the end, thought he was dispensable." No one laughed after that. Patricia finally spoke. "I was wrong. I said something careless and I didn't defend you when I should have. But is this really worth tearing everything apart?" Her voice cracked then, her eyes wet. "We built a life." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "We built a life based on the assumption that I would keep swallowing every slight, that my decency was infinite, that I'd keep giving even when I was being diminished. You don't get to mock someone and still expect their loyalty." Talia entered the room then, slow and awkward, like someone walking into a funeral she'd cost. She didn't sit down, just stood by the wall, arms crossed. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she said. I was joking. Her voice had a hollow quality. Teenage indifference masking insecurity. "I didn't think you'd take it so personal." I met her eyes. "Then maybe you're not ready to live in a world where words have consequences." She frowned. "You're supposed to be the grown-up." "Exactly," I said. "Which is why I'm teaching you something no one else has. Actions have prices. And sometimes, respect costs more than an apology after the damage is done." She looked to her mother then, silently pleading. Patricia looked away. When the dinner finally ended, and the last wine glass was washed, Patricia stood by the sink while I dried the dishes. "You made your point," she said softly. "They'll all go home thinking you're cold, but you made it." I didn't answer right away. I stared out the window, watching the wind bend the branches of the tree in the yard. Then I said, "Let them think what they want." I didn't lose myself for their comfort. She turned to me then, face raw. "Is there any chance for us, honestly?" I met her gaze. "Only if you learn to see me, not just use me. Only if you understand that love without respect is just dependence." She wiped a tear from her cheek, nodded slowly. "I hear you," she whispered. "I just wish it hadn't come to this." I sighed. "So do I. But we don't always get to choose the moment we wake up. Just what we do after." I didn't leave the house right away. That would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, I let the decision settle over days like dust on unused furniture. I moved through the house with quiet intention, still polite, still civil, but no longer attached. Patricia tried to bridge the space with small gestures, leaving the kettle whistling when she knew I was about to enter the kitchen, folding my laundry before I got to it, sending short messages in the middle of the day. "Hope your meeting went well." But none of it touched me. They were guilt-driven courtesies, not the currency of genuine remorse. There's something about betrayal that, once named, makes even kindness feel artificial. I had reached a place beyond negotiation, beyond the need to be understood. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply preserving myself. On the third Thursday after the dinner, I moved my things into the guest room. Patricia didn't ask questions. She just stood at the door while I folded shirts into a duffel bag, her eyes soft and full of things she didn't say. I knew she wanted to ask if it was permanent. I knew she hoped it wasn't. But neither of us spoke. That night, in that smaller bed with the stiff mattress and thinner blanket, I slept deeper than I had in weeks. Peace doesn't always come wrapped in joy. Sometimes it arrives in the form of distance, in the refusal to shrink for people who refuse to grow. Talia didn't say goodbye. The weekend came, and she left to stay at her friend's house without a word. I suppose in her mind, silence was the punishment. But I didn't take it that way. I had stopped expecting closure from people who didn't value clarity. She would learn, Eventually, life has a way of making us sit with the echoes of our own behavior. My absence would teach her far more than any lecture ever could. The final conversation came quietly on a rainy Sunday morning. Patricia knocked on the guest room door, gently, like someone asking for access to a space they no longer had a key to. I opened it and stepped aside. She didn't sit. She just looked around the room, then at me. "You've really left, haven't you?" Her voice didn't carry anger anymore. Just fatigue. Sadness. I nodded. I think we both knew this was coming. We just didn't want to be the one to admit it. She looked down at the floor. I thought love would be enough. I let out a breath. So did I? But love without respect isn't love. It's just emotional debt. She closed her eyes then, and when she opened them, there were tears she didn't bother to hide. "I never meant to humiliate you," she said. I didn't know what to do in that moment. I walked over, gently handed her a tissue from the nightstand. "You chose not to protect me. That was your moment. And you made your choice." She reached out then, touched my arm. "Is there really no way back from this?" I looked at her hand, then at her. There's always a way back, but not to the same place. And I'm not willing to go backward for comfort. I'm moving forward for peace. Her hand dropped, slowly, and she nodded. I understand. And I believed she did. Too late, but genuinely. I moved out the following weekend. Not in anger, not in haste, just quietly. I found a small apartment across town. Simple, clean, mine. I filled it with things that brought me calm. Books, warm light, plants that didn't need too much attention. I cooked for myself, walked in the evenings, reconnected with a few old friends who reminded me who I was before I deluded myself to keep a family together. The silence in my new space was different from the silence I left behind. It didn't stalk me or accuse me. It soothed. It reminded me that peace was possible, even if it required letting go of the people you once built your world around. Months passed. Patricia called a few times. Sometimes to ask questions about bills or logistics, sometimes just to check in. I never blocked her, but I didn't encourage the calls either. They came less often. Eventually they stopped. I didn't feel triumphant, just resolved. The wound had scabbed. The scar would remain, but the bleeding had stopped. I look back now, not with regret, but with clarity. I know I did the right thing. I stood up for myself in a house that no longer recognized my worth. I drew a line when I realized I was being erased. I said no, not because I didn't love them, but because I finally loved myself enough to stop begging for basic decency. People say forgiveness is essential. I don't disagree, but forgiveness isn't the same as access. I forgave them both. I just didn't let them back in. And that, I've learned, is the real cost of disrespect. It's not the immediate fallout. It's what it takes from a relationship that may never come back. Respect, once broken, doesn't always grow back the same. Sometimes it dies. And when it does, the only healthy thing left to do is bury it and walk away. So I did. And I've been breathing easier ever since. If this story moved you or made you reflect on your own boundaries and self-worth, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life inspired narratives that dive deep into the complexities of family, respect, and emotional growth. Your support helps bring more powerful stories like this to life. See you soon in the next one.